Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you all to the AFT Local 1796 educational series, basically entitled The History of Unions in the United States. It's a very, very broad topic. Labor unions have played a critical role in American society, but many people are unaware of the history of the U.S. union movement. The AFT, which is the union that represents faculty and professional staff here at William Paterson University, is sponsoring this educational lecture designed to inform the William Paterson University community about this important history. I want to explain something to you. I'm sure in the media you hear a lot about being brainwashed in the liberal environment of the universities. We are not here to brainwash you. We're here to educate you. And in my class, my students are going to be summarizing the lecture that's being presented, and they're also going to be writing a reaction paper. So I hope you will enjoy this lecture, and I hope you will make sure that you understand the importance of being good citizens so that you make sure you sign up and vote and be a part of the political environment that you are now critical in terms of what you constitute in the state of New Jersey. Gene Carroll is our guest lecturer. Gene was a labor and social justice organizer for unions that include the Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers Union and the United Mine Workers of America. So I'd like to now introduce our special guest lecturer, Gene.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. All right. Nice, beautiful day outside. Thank you for coming to the class. I want to say real quick a thank you to AFT Local 1796, to Sue Tardy, the president, to Kelly McNeil, the political coordinator, and Professor Stephen Shalom, who've helped put this together. And I also want you to know that just a little more about my background. I am now on the faculty at Cornell University, the New York State School of Industrial and Labor Relations, and I direct the co-director of the New York State AFL-CIO Union Leadership Institute, which is an institute that seeks to develop the union officers and staff and members who will lead the unions in New York over the next generation. I'm also an adjunct instructor in labor history at the City University of New York. And I also wanted to mention to you that I have the pleasure of bringing a person who is accompanying me today is Evelyn Hershey. Evelyn is the education coordinator, education director at the Botto House National American Labor Museum Botto House National Landmark, which we'll get back to in a moment. Okay, does anybody know what this is? Anybody ever see this before? How about this? They're going back and forth. Anybody have an idea what this is? We know the word Paterson, right? This photograph was taken almost 100 years ago, right down the road in Haledon, New Jersey, in the huge Paterson silk strike. And we're going to come back to that in a few minutes. Evelyn's going to talk about that, but let's jump in. But to do that, let's do this. What do we know about labor history? Who can tell me something about labor history you might know? Anybody? Anybody have a parent, a grandparent, aunt or an uncle? Worked in the auto factory? Yeah. In the Postal Workers Union. And they're facing a big problem, as you probably know, right? Yeah. Postal system is shrinking because of modern technology. And there's a threat of hundreds of thousands of workers with middle-class wages losing their jobs. Anybody else know anything about labor history? Come on, throw something out. Something positive, negative, up, down, a story you might have heard. Okay. Well, I can guarantee you that there's a lot of labor history which you may not know about. Anybody ever hear of James Baldwin? African-American writer, Harlem Renaissance writer, tremendous American artist in the middle of the 20th century. We are trapped in history, and history is trapped in us, he said. So even if you can't conjure up some information now about labor history, it's in there. And maybe at the end of the talk today, you'll be able to identify some of it. Now, the reason I say that is because labor history is a key part of American history. And the writing of history is about the relationship of truth to power. Anybody want to take a shot at what that means? The writing of history is about the relationship of truth to power. I didn't write that, by the way. Somebody else did, and I couldn't find the source. As an academic, that's sort of a mortal sin. But what's even a worse sin is to take credit for something that's not yours. So that is not mine, but it's a pretty strong statement. Anybody want to take a shot at that? Go ahead. All right. Hang on one second. Young man?
Whoever has power writes history.
You're pretty hot. Pretty on target.
Power has the power of deception.
Say again?
Power has the power of deception.
Power is the power of deception. And what did you just say a minute ago? Whoever has power writes history. At the end of World War II, Winston Churchill, who was the leader of England, as you probably heard, and the victor in the war and played a great role in defeating fascism in Germany, he was, before he became prime minister, he was a writer and a journalist. He wrote an 8-volume history of World War II at the end of World War II, because he knew that historians for generations were going to write a lot about World War II and his place in it. And he had the frame of mind and the presence of mind to come out the gate and write the first comprehensive history. He was a very powerful man. So oftentimes, what's written about history is based on the victors in history. The great man version of history, the great president, the great prime minister, the great corporate leader. It has value. It's not an invalid way to look at the role of important, prominent people in history. The great general, the great nautical achievements of seafaring men like Christopher Columbus. But here's where we're talking about something different. We're talking about a different kind of history. Instead of the history of Christopher Columbus, the history I'm talking about is a history that says, what happened to all the indigenous people who lived on the islands in the Caribbean where Christopher Columbus landed? What happened to those people? So the history of labor is akin to this kind of history. It looks at history from those who were vulnerable, not from the victors. What happened to all the workers in Paterson, for example, who were involved in the strike that Evelyn will speak about in a few minutes? What happened to the sit-down workers in Flint, Michigan, who were up against a giant, the richest, most powerful corporation in the world, General Motors, in the 1930s. And these workers were trying to win a decent wage in an 8-hour day. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. So this is labor history. It's the role of workers in building our nation's economy and in building our society. And I asked at the beginning, who knows something about labor history? And no one put their hand up. Now, I'm of course convinced that you know more about it than you may be telling me, but labor history is also American history. Labor history, in fact, is an integral part of nearly all the overarching problems of U.S. history. Race and slavery, democracy and freedom, equality and justice, war and violence, the rights of women, the rights of men, the role of labor, the development of a competitive economy, and the ideals of the Founding Father. But labor history is little known and not well understood. Now, I passed out to everybody it's on tan-colored paper. Anybody want to hold that up? You should have this. When you get a chance, take a look at this. This is a research paper just released about the fact that labor history has been given short shrift in U.S. textbooks. There's a whole lot of work going on now about the importance of U.S. labor history and its absence in our national dialogue and our national myth about ourselves that we grow up hearing, that get reinforced all the time. How can we make sense of whatever labor's role in history is? What have labor unions accomplished? What have they done? What do they do? To get at that series of questions, let's consider some current economic indicators of poverty and equality in the United States. And as we're checking this out, you might ask, well, what in God's name does that have to do with the role of labor in U.S. history? Let's see. According to September 2011 report, 2.6 more million people joined the poverty ranks since 2009. Poverty defined by the federal government as a family of four living at or near the poverty line of $21,765 in annual income. This is the largest increase since 1993. 15.1% of the United States population lives in poverty. Of course, if you want to get technical about it, what about the people who make $21,766? So keep that thought in mind too. They might not fit this definition, but the ones who make $766 might be pretty close to poverty too. And there are a lot of those folks. By the way, these are Census Bureau figures from last month, from September. I didn't cook this up. These are Census Bureau figures. Latino children had the largest increase from 2007 to 2010. 36% increase. Black children, 39.1% of the black population. 5 million white children in poverty, about 12.4% of the white population. Just under 1/3 of families led by a single mother live at or below the poverty line. What does this have to do with the history of labor? At St. John's Bread and Life, which is a soup kitchen in the Bedford-Stuyvesant section of Brooklyn, traffic for meals went up 17% in 1 year from 2009 to 2010. As you might guess, people who do this kind of research, one of the first places they look, in addition to looking at the Census Bureau data is they go to the soup kitchens and they want to know, what's the traffic? What's the traffic? Now, this is a particular case in Brooklyn, New York, but this dynamic is happening in cities and towns across America. Organizing is about overcoming what separates us. We'll come back to that. I didn't mean to put that up there, but it's one of my favorite quotes. So, what does this have to do with the history of labor in the United States? Well, let's take a look at this statistic. I just gave you some data about the expansion, the increase, the enlargement of poverty in the United States. Now, I know that many of you may be connected to some of those facts in your own lives. I gave you information about the increase of inequality in the United States. Since 1953, the year I was born, God forbid, 58 years ago, that was the peak of the power of organized labor in the United States. 35.7% of all workers in the private sector economy were in labor unions, 1/3. In 2010, it's 6.9%. People, do you see where I'm going here? Anybody have an idea where I'm going here? I see your head shaking back there.
Well, back then it was industrialization, and now it's not.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Back in the 1970s, about 30% of our workforce was involved in manufacturing. About 12% of it now. And in the 80s, for example, the huge collapse of the steel industry and the auto plants, those millions and millions of jobs in working class communities were pretty much destroyed. And most of those jobs were union jobs, where a man could work or a woman could work in a steel factory and make enough money to buy a house, have a decent retirement, help get the kids through college. Those jobs are all gone now. So what I'm suggesting to you in thinking about the question of what role do unions play in society, what do unions do, what are they supposed to do, they advance economic security. They build up the income of society. So when you see this huge drop in the power of organized labor over the last 3 generations, and you see the increase in poverty and inequality, there's a relationship there. Let's go on to something. Any questions so far? Okay. Rising inequality. I borrowed this graph from a friend of mine the other day, and I have no idea what that is, so just ignore it. But what it does show is the increase in inequality. And compare that to the decline in the power of unions. One graph line is going way up, the other is going way down. Here's another one. So the decline of the power of unions in the last couple of generations, the last 30 years or so, has been pretty dramatic. And one of the consequences is a huge disparity in productivity and wages. if you look at the economic data over the last couple of generations, and this directly affects me and you and our families, you'll see that around the latter part of the 1970s, a trend was broken. After World War II, productivity gains and wage increases matched each other. But right around the late 70s and early 80s, huge separation began. If you look at economic facts, you'll see that real wages, purchasing power, has basically remained flat. But productivity increases have remained large. This is at the same time when the power of labor unions has been in severe decline. So I don't have a pointer, but let me ask this. Does anybody know what this is in here? What this represents? Top line is productivity. This flat line is wages, which has remained flat instead of going up with productivity. Anybody have an idea what this space in here represents? That's profit. That's profit. Between 1979 and 2005, inflation-adjusted income of middle-income families rose 21%. Now that's growth, but it's slow, especially compared with the 100% rise in median income for the generation immediately after World War II and the World War II generation. So that would be from 47 up to this point. Productivity and wages matched. Meanwhile, between 79 and 2009, for the income of the very rich, that is the top 100th of 1% of income distribution, rose by 480%. 480%. Middle income families, where most of us come from, it rose 21%. So in 2009 dollars, the average annual income rose from $4.2 million for those folks from the late 70s, for the top, to $24.3 million, their average annual income. Harper's Index, I don't have that up here. Harper's, as many of you know, it's Harper's Magazine. It's been around for 150 years. Every month they publish a page of statistics about anything, about how many gallons of water are in Lake Geneva. You know, some of them are silly and crazy, but they're verified. It's a lot of fun to read. But last month they had a percentage of profits of American corporations paid in taxes in 1961. In 1961, when wages and productivity gains were matching each other, middle-class families were doing pretty well in the post-war boom. Corporations paid 40.6% of their profits in taxes. In 2010, when their productivity and their profits are increasing, these profits belong to them, they're paying 10.5% of their profits in taxes. Now, a lot of this goes against the grain of what you're hearing every day. A lot of this goes against the grain of what the big, handsome governor in this state tells you every day. Guys like me are the boogeyman. I'm a union guy. Think about the data I just gave you. So, for generations, unions have been in the forefront for a higher minimum wage, for health and safety in the workplace, for better wages, support for public education, equal rights, national health insurance, family leave, fair treatment. When was the last time you heard a lot of politicians from a certain political persuasion who will speak about the importance of something like family leave. What's family leave? Anybody know what it is? Yes, sir.
Isn't it when you have a family emergency or something?
Family emergency. This is what unions do. I have the benefit of having a daughter who lives in Europe. She's 35. She just had her second child. I just became a grandpop for the second time. She's educated. She went to college. She's a working class, middle class woman. Her husband got 3 weeks off at 75% pay from the day the baby was born. So for the first 3 weeks, which is pretty traumatic time when you have a baby, if you don't know that, you're going to find out, the husband was there with her, and the state paid for that. So we have this rhetoric in this country that says we care about families, but what about family leave? Family leave is also about when you have a sick parent or a sick spouse or a sick kid. I don't mean a kid with a cold or the flu. I mean somebody who's really sick, somebody with cancer. So it's a question about what kind of society you want to have. Do you want to have flexibility in the workforce? One of the things unions do is they fight for family leave against the whole culture that says, no way. It'll ruin the economy. It'll ruin our lives. It'll destroy profit. It's socialism. It's communism. So that's one of the roles that unions play. But even more fundamentally, I don't mean to be glib. Actually, maybe I do just a little bit. But unions play in the labor market, unions play an equalizing role. That's what they do. Increase wages, decrease inequality. So one question might be, well, what happened? What's wrong with those unions? How come they're getting their butts kicked for 2 generations? They're being destroyed. One answer is, at the end of World War II, in late 40s and early 50s, 1/3 of the workforce was in unions. And corporations decided that unions were too strong. The middle class was too strong. So there has been a concerted effort over generations to destroy the ability of unions to function in America. Now, did you know that there's a law? In 1935, the National Labor Relations Act was passed by Congress during the middle of the Great Depression. At the peak of the Great Depression, 25% of the workforce in the United States was out of work. Not 9% like it is today, or 16% in the African American community, which is pretty awful, but across the board, 1 out of 4 workers were out of a job and in bread lines. You've seen pictures of the Great Depression, people in bread lines. That's what the data was. In other cities like Cleveland and Dayton, Ohio, the unemployment rate was 65, 75%. 3 out of 4 workers had no job. Unions really organized. The National Labor Relations Act was passed in 1935, which says that the law of the land is that workers in the private sector workforce have the right to organize a union, free from fear and intimidation. You have the right to choose whether or not you want to belong to a union. Unions fought for a long time to get to that point. And ever since that law was passed, there's been a concerted campaign to destroy that. There's also the factor of globalization. Another reason why unions are in big trouble in America. You've been studying about this. Another word for globalization is the Walmartization of our economy. The Walmart model being adopted by corporations around the world. What do? Low-wage labor, Mexico, China, Taiwan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, India. You wonder why those prices are so small when you go to Walmart? You wonder why unions like United Food and Commercial Workers here in New Jersey are fighting to prevent the expansion of Walmart, and they're fighting to prevent the expansion of Walmart in Brooklyn and in Queens and in the Bronx? Because those stores, that multinational chain comes in, can offer lower prices, which benefits people. There's no question about that. But stores that have been in those communities for generations can't compete with low wages. So the union's job in a society and an economy is to take wages out of competition. If I'm competing against you and you have a unionized firm that pays $20 an hour and I have a non-union firm that pays $10 an hour, you're in trouble economically in the long run, right? But if a union, either directly or indirectly, can raise the wages of the economy in that particular industry, it benefits everybody. So low wages are a real problem. And many, many of these corporations that pay less taxes now have no allegiance to the United States of America. They'll go and have manufacturing done wherever they can get the cheapest labor. So unions push back against exploitation. And in a minute, I'm going to give it to Evelyn to talk briefly about one example of labor history right down the street. But there's three benefits of joining a union. One is, if you're in a union, you're no longer at will. You're no longer an at-will employee. Does anybody know what that is? Anybody know what an at-will employee is? Yeah. I don't like your hat. You're fired. I mean, I can't say publicly, I don't like your beard. I don't like the color of your skin. I don't like your gender. Now, that's against the law. But there's ways to get around that. At will means I can fire your butt right now because I'm in a bad mood. Goodbye. If only 11.9% of all workers in America now are in unions when you take in the public sector, that means basically 88% of American workers are at will. If you have a union, you have due process. You have a just cause standard. I can't fire you unless there's a hearing. There's standards in the contract. There's an element of job security here in due process. Sounds like a good thing. Workplace, the benefits of a union in the workplace. You have a voice at work. You have a voice at work. And that means something small, both in terms of resolving a problem in the workplace. You have access to arbitration to deal with workplace disputes, instead of the dispute just being solved by arbitrary decision. You have a voice at work. And then in society, you have the benefit of unions working together when they do it well and with their coalition partners to fight for those kinds of social and economic benefits that I had talked about before. So I want to suggest to you that when you study labor history, if you're going to begin to study it at all, go way back to the beginning, before there were formalized unions. Go way back to the 1650s, when we had indentured servants and slaves. They formed a big, big part of the labor system in the early part of America, before we actually became the United States. in 1787 or 1789. Indentured servants. Thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of mostly men, some women, in prisons in England were shipped over to America to get rid of them, and they were indentured servants. They had to serve at least 7 years as someone's slave, and then they can become free. And most of them were white, and a lot of them did become free. But then we have the slave trade. So the reason I mention indentured servants and slave trade is that if you're going to begin to study labor, go back to the beginning. Where would the original accumulation of capital used to construct economic development in North America have come from, if not the extraction of wealth from the slave trade? What does the slave trade have to do with labor history? Think about it. If we believe that history has a role to play in helping us understand who we are, where we came from, how the systems we live under, the laws we live under were developed, the first 260 years of America's existence was based in a huge way on a system of labor relations called slavery. So the laws and attitudes that permeate society and the culture from that history might still be with us today. Oh, that's not true. That's ridiculous. That was then. Let me give you an example. Major part of labor history. 1935, the passage of the National Labor Relations Act that I mentioned before, passed under FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, as part of his New Deal. This was a major social advance. Gave workers the chance to organize collectively, concerted activity in the workplace. You and I working together with all of our fellow employees was legal for the first time under national law. It used to be a conspiracy. You could be thrown in jail for trying to organize a union, when in fact it's exercising your right of assembly in the Constitution. But stay with me for one more minute. The National Labor Relations Act was going to give rights to people. It was a social advance. It was going to allow people to develop unions which have the power to be a counterweight to the huge business and corporate interests which want to keep as much of that profit as possible. So how could FDR get that passed by Congress? He made a deal with the devil. Who was the devil? He got all the senators, who at that time were members of the Democratic Party, from the Deep South, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, etc., Louisiana, Arkansas, to vote for this piece of progressive legislation. How could he possibly get these men who wouldn't even vote for an anti-lynching bill to vote for a bill that would give millions of workers the rights to organize? And how is slavery part of this? Well, if you're at all familiar with that part of American history, that was the era of Jim Crow, the era of enforced segregation, right? Those of you who are African American, I need to tell you very little about this. You can tell me a lot more. In 1898, Jim Crow was beautifully summarized by that judge who said there are no rights a black man, there are no rights for a black man that any white man has to respect. That's the world of the Jim Crow South. So the senators from these states said to FDR, we'll vote for this bill. We'll cut a deal. But here's the thing. We got to have some exclusions in that bill. Oh, what do you mean? Agricultural workers in the South can't be covered by this bill. Agricultural workers in the South, 92% of them African American. Domestic workers, No way are we giving those folks any rights. Almost all the domestic workers in the South were African American. So agricultural workers and domestic workers are excluded. Another American policy of exclusion. Slavery's influence. Jim Crow is post-slavery world. 13th Amendment outlawed slavery, but it did not outlaw the world of Jim Crow. So that influence created the National Labor Relations Act, under which 103 million workers in America today function, or could function. Only 6.9% of them are in unions. There's just one example of how this labor relations system that began in 1632, we're still living with the consequences of it today, regardless of our color or our gender. So when you think about the role of unions in society, unions, given their problems and their weaknesses and the dumb things they've done and some of the corruption they've had, yes, it's all true. Unions are a magnificent, uplifting, progressive force in history. They've created this system known as collective bargaining. Collective bargaining, which many, if not most, of the employees on this campus, not just the teachers, but the PBA, the sergeants, the professional staff, the folks who clean the toilets, most of them are members of a union. They have collective bargaining. Under the National Labor Relations Act in 1935, which I just talked about, it's where representatives of the union, chosen only by the workers, meet with the employer and work out a contract. This is an alternative to massive strikes, collective bargaining. So that's a modern term, but you should come to understand what it is, because it affects you and will affect you in your life. But it's a process that is democratic, and it's also conservative, because it's about people sitting down and working out their differences, signing a contract. So for the next 4 years, we'll live by these means. Sounds pretty rational to me, but that process is being continuously undermined, and there are millions and hundreds of millions of workers around the world who have no access to collective bargaining. Is this a test? I'm joking. Okay. So, just give me 1 second. Don't move. Just want to get some water. I didn't touch anything, honest. So what I would like to do, before I give some closing comments and then take a few questions, is turn the floor over to my colleague, Evelyn Hershey. Evelyn is the education director at the Botto House American Labor History Museum, which is just down the street. And she has very kindly agreed to come up here today and talk briefly about an amazing piece of labor history that happened 100 years ago, right around the corner.
Thank you. When you came in, you may have seen or received a brochure from the museum, and I'll just point it out to you because the image at the top is the image that was on the screen when we were all asked if anyone had recognized this image. It's a photograph of a private home that belonged to Italian immigrants who worked in silk mills in Paterson. The home is located in Haledon, and it is the headquarters of the American Labor Museum. The house was built in 1908. The photo that is on the brochure and that was on our screen, the photo was taken in the spring of 1913 during a very dramatic and significant event in the history of New Jersey, particularly New Jersey's working people's history. And so many of us don't know about it. In fact, neighbors in Haledon don't know the story. The family, the Botto family, had a series of photographs of these great crowds in front of their home and knew little about it. A family member began doing research in the 1970s, and that opened a lot of doors. We see a lot of visitors at the museum, including students, high school students, college students, students of all ages who are interested in the story because they have a relationship to it. Many of us who live in this area have family members who came to Paterson, New Jersey as immigrants. How many of you are immigrants yourselves or have family members who are immigrants? Fair number of us. If we go back generations, all of us have ties to immigrant ancestors. We know these immigrants came to the United States with hopes, most of them with hopes for a better life. Those who came in slavery, their story is very different. But many of our ancestors, and those of us who still come today, come with an American dream, a home of our own, education for our children, a future for our families. The Botto family was no different. They were like many who came to Paterson in search of a home, a place to work. The city offered nearly 300 textile mills that created all types of silk fabric. We don't think of silk as such a significant commodity today. We have synthetic fabrics, but in the early 1900s, silk was a major product. Paterson silk was purchased around the country. In fact, it was cheaper for you as a consumer to buy Paterson silk than it was to buy silk made in other silk centers around the world. The federal government had created protective tariffs, and so the silk industry was booming in the early 1900s. It required skilled and unskilled workers. The Botto family were a family of skilled weavers. They brought years of experience, that is Pietro and Maria, to a Paterson silk industry, as did many workers who came not only from northern Italy, but from Łódź, Poland. There were many Jewish workers who came from those areas, Russian-speaking workers, Germans, French. There were some workers from Syria. There were immigrants from the Netherlands, from England, all working in the silk mills. It was known that the manufacturers of Paterson sent representatives to Ellis Island to recruit a mix of workers from different countries. It meant that in the workplace, it was easier for the overseers to control their workforce. They could play one group against the other, get more work out of the Polish workers if they told the other workers that the Poles were lazy, for example. The silk mills were difficult places to work before labor laws. Look around this room. There are exit signs, fire extinguishers. There was no type of provision for safety of workers in the silk mills of Paterson. There were many accidents. Workers who lost scalps, parts of fingers and arms from the moving parts of the machines. Dangerous places to work, but highly desirable at the time because the silk mills were kept cleaner than other mills in Paterson. The mills were kept clean because the silk had been purchased by the mill owners. It was brought in from Asia and Italy. An investment had been made in this raw silk, and the owners of the mills wanted a profit from it. The mills were kept clean, not for the workers, but for the product. In the workplaces, there were children who labored also. New Jersey had labor laws in the early 1900s, but working families earned low wages, so low that without the income of children too, they could not make ends meet. There were kids as young as 8 and 9 years old working in the mills in Paterson. This is just a little bit of a background for you and to give you a sense of why, and there were many strikes in Paterson silk mills. In 1913, something different happened. The workers went on strike in January, cold month. In response to a speed up, one mill owner, Henry Dougherty, whose mill was located near Corrado's, if you know the neighborhood, he had purchased new equipment, new looms, easier to operate, and instituted what the workers called a speed up, an increase in loom assignment from 2 looms per weaver to 4 looms per weaver, without an increase in wages. What it meant for Mr. Dougherty was that he could reduce his payroll. He didn't have to pay out as much to his workers. He only needed half the size of a workforce as he had prior. For the workers, it meant increased production. It meant a loss of jobs for half of the workforce. This was somewhat, you could say, the straw that broke the camel's back. The workers in Henry Dougherty's mill walked out on strike at the end of January. By February of 1913, nearly 25,000 men, women, and children walked out of the remaining silk mills in the city, nearly 300. This was a workforce of primarily immigrants. Pietro Botta was a new citizen of the United States as of 1902. Others were working towards naturalization. These were immigrants speaking different languages. These were half men, half women, an equal number of men and women in this workforce, largely a young workforce, and also children included in the group. They invited a labor union, the industrial workers of the world, to come in and advise them. And that's an important word to keep in mind, advise them. They didn't always agree with the recommendations of the IWW organizers. The workers ran their own strike. They had a lot of conversations and meetings, big groups and small groups. They discussed any types of responses from overseers in their particular plants. They had shop reports each day. They gathered and talked about relief efforts. How would they feed their families, pay their rent while there was no income during the strike? They were extremely well organized and ran their strike democratically. They voted, and as I said, did not always agree with the recommendations of the IWW organizers. I will say that the one organizer from the union who was here the most was a young woman, 22 years old, around your age. Her name was Elizabeth Gurley, G-U-R-L-E-Y, Flynn, an Irish woman. And Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was already a veteran union organizer when she came to Paterson. She held mass meetings for workers. She held meetings for women only, during which young women strikers were encouraged to give speeches during the meetings, to lead picket lines and become more active in labor and become organizers later on after the strike. The union found that the workers were better off running their own strike. In the city of Paterson, the organizers were considered outside agitators. There was one organizer, another Irishman, Patrick Quinlan, who was taken to jail every time he arrived in Paterson by train and stepped onto the platform to enter the city. He broke no law. He was taken to jail. Picket lines in Paterson were broken up by police. Picketers were put in jail for peaceful picketing. They broke no law. The police were under the control of the mayor and the council of Paterson, who were on the side of the mill owners. There was no justice for the workers in Paterson. Eventually, their meeting halls were closed. We have email and all means of communication, YouTube. These workers needed to meet face-to-face to continue their strike. So they appealed to the mayor of the borough of Haledon. Haledon is just north of the city of Paterson. The mayor of the city, of the borough of Haledon, William Brookman, was elected on the Socialist Party ticket. And the Socialist Party, as you may know from history, was a major political party in the early 1900s, ran candidates for president who garnered a number of votes. William Brookman, socialist mayor of Haledon, German immigrant, husband of a weaver, allowed the workers to meet in his borough. And in the Mile Square borough of Haledon, weavers and dye shop workers lived, many northern Italian immigrants like the Bottos. Pietro and Maria Botto's home included a balcony on the second floor, and before their house and property they did not own, there was a green with good acoustics. The green is shaped like a bowl, so when you go up to the balcony and speak, your voice can be heard by crowds. Meetings were held at the Botto House. Union organizers from the IWW spoke in the language of the workers, Italian, Polish, Russian, French, German, so everyone could understand. The workers knew their solidarity was their best chance to succeed. In the factories, they saw plenty of times how prejudice and the difference of workers could be used against them, and no one succeeded and no one got ahead. The only way they knew they could succeed was by standing together. So what did they want? We look at the Occupy Wall Street people and ask, well, what do they want? They're having a lot of conversations in those camps in our cities around the country now, too. The workers' main demand was for an 8-hour day. They didn't necessarily want a shorter workday so that they would have more free time, although that was an important part of the strike. An 8-hour day demand was a demand for some control over their daily lives and a voice in the workplace. Their slogans, 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will, 24 hours in a day, 8 times 3. They certainly were seeking some free time, some time to rest so there would be less accidents in the mills. But a voice in the workplace, some ability to have a say over a workload, over pay, was really significant and important to them. That was their main demand. In the end, in 1913, the workers were starved back to work. They returned to the mills shortly after the pageant of the Paterson silk strike. And the other image that you were looking at of a worker with a red sky behind him and the initials of the industrial workers of the world behind him is the cover of the program for the pageant of the Paterson silk strike, a major fundraiser that involved New York City bohemians, Mabel Dodge, Upton Sinclair, the writer, was involved in supporting the strikers, John Reed of the movie Reds. During this event, during the pageant, the workers themselves became actors. They reenacted the events of their strike, and the funds that were brought in were intended to help the relief effort. The strike ended by July. The workers, as I said, we say were starved back to work. They agreed individually with each employer in their 300 shops to some sort of resolution to the strike, and most were simply lucky to get their jobs back. An 8-hour day was not one. That would not come until 1919. But the workers took a lot away from this strike. They saw lawmakers after the strike hold hearings to learn about the working conditions, to write labor laws, some of which were overturned by courts. But they felt that their struggle was a broader one, much like the Occupy Wall Street folks today. We can look at those images and relate to this collective energy of the time. And I'd just like to close with the words of one striker because I thought it was so relative to Occupy Wall Street today and 100 years ago, these 1913 strikers. Sophie Cohen, a silk worker, the daughter of a Jewish immigrant father, said after a meeting of strikers, "We really thought we were building a new society. It wasn't only hours, it wasn't only an increase in pay, it was changing everything. That's what we felt."
Thank you.
Thanks.
It's wonderful. Evelyn, thank you, because I wanted to bring my brief remarks to a close by just saying that the Occupy Wall Street phenomena, which is now happening, that I'm sure you're aware of, has antecedents in the labor movement, in the civil rights movement, in the women's movement, in the anti-war movement, in the Underground Railroad movement prior to the Civil War, which was the first mass civil disobedience phenomenon in American history. Federal law said if slaves are captured, they got to be sent to back to their master. So there's all these stories and facts and rich history of resistance to oppressive authority and unfairness and inequality and injustice in America, and the Paterson strike is just one of them. Again, it's about the history from below. Dr. Martin Luther King, in 1961, spoke to the convention of the National Labor Federation, the AFL-CIO, the American Federation of Labor, Congress of Industrial Organizations, which still exists today. And Dr. King closed his speech at that time with this quote: "History is a great teacher. Everyone knows that the labor movement did not diminish the strength of our nation, but enlarged it. Those who today attack labor forget these simple truths, but history remembers them." And I think that is, it's hard to come up with a better thought to leave you with than these words, and from someone who was, well, such a moral giant in American history. And he understood the importance of economic and social justice and the role of the labor movement in advancing it. So with the 1 minute that we have left, I wanted to see if there was a question or two I could answer. Yes?
How can you learn more about the statistics that you brought up about the unemployment and the rates of the wages?
www.bls.gov. That's the Bureau of Labor Statistics. bls.gov. That'll get you a lot of the information you want. The Census Bureau will also get you a lot of the information you want. Any other questions? Yes?
Has management seen any advantages to labor organizing? As the other side, it's always framed in the discussion in terms of what the workers gain.
Right.
Has management gained anything in the bargain?
Well, there are firms that have had, it's a very good question, thank you. There are firms that have had many years of experience in a collective bargaining relationship with a labor union. And one of the things they get is a workforce that is not only experienced in that industry, but a workforce that is dedicated. There's a certain loyalty to that particular employer. Unions are constantly interested in making sure that their members are trained with the latest technology available. You know, in, for example, the construction industry, for example, there are the schools for apprenticeship programs. You know, in the construction industry now, it's not just how you hammer a nail into a board, but there's a lot more computer and electronic technology involved in construction. So there's stability, really, in that industry that a good collective bargaining relationship can bring. And it's one of the reasons why, for example, in the public sector, many workers who've worked for the state government or city government for many years are increasingly frustrated by this right-wing attack that says, let's take services that the city has and privatize it and contract it out. Well, what happens when that happens? What happens is it's contracted out to a corporation that may do the job, but the corporation is going to pay their workers less than the public employees. So you might say in the short term, well, that's a good deal for the taxpayers because that's less money we have to pay out. When in fact, a recent federal study indicated that many of the privatization schemes on the federal level turned out to have cost overruns that quadruple the cost of the privatization or costing out strategy, which is paid for by the taxpayer. And what it does is it rips out of the state or the city government employees who have dedicated their workforce experience to public service. And you know, that's a much more complicated question than what many of the advocates of it, some of them who are in your state capital, would tell us. And not only your state capital, but many others. It's 3:17. Thank you very much, and thank you for being here.